Welcome, everybody.
Hey, hey. Good boy, Tucker.
Work smarter where you want.
This is learning at its most fun.
Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for another Practice Management Takeover. Today we have Chad over here actually from RIA in Box, and we're going to be talking about conducting your RIA's firm's annual compliance review. So I always just like to go over little housekeeping reminders, and as well as introduce, we have Chad on the line with us. For everyone who may have not hopped on a training webinar with us before, my name is Catherine Beltran. I'm one of the trainers here at Redtail Technology. But again, those little reminders that we do have the Q&A function available, as well as I want to say the chat is also an option. I'll go ahead. I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to pass it off to Chad. He's really going to take you through all those details. So Chad, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take over that new share and go for it.
All righty. Awesome. Glad. All right. Well, thank you for having me here today. Thanks to Redtail for inviting RI in a Box, here to talk about compliance. It's what we love to do here at RI in a Box, is talk about compliance. So thank you for Redtail and to inviting us for their practice management webinar. Today, I'm going to be talking about conducting an annual compliance review, because it's that magic time of year where firms should be conducting an annual compliance review. So without further ado, let's kind of just get right into it. Other thing I'm going to talk about briefly today, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I do want to touch base on establishing an effective compliance program just a little bit. But most of the focus today is going to be on conducting an annual review. When we talk about establishing a firm's culture of compliance, sometimes it is an overused type of phrase in the industry, culture of compliance. The SEC will actually refer to this as the tone at the top. I like to call it culture of compliance, but we really mean kind of the same thing. And that is, are you a firm that takes your compliance seriously? Or are you a firm that views compliance as nothing more than a nuisance? And it makes a really big difference on how your examinations will go, how your audits will go. As a former regulator, when I walk into an office, I can generally tell you pretty much in the first 5 minutes, is this a firm that has that culture, that tone at the top or not? And it can make a big difference on how your exam goes from that point on. So it is a critical atmosphere that you want to create, that, yes, we do take this seriously. We understand it's part of the industry, and we're going to do whatever we need to do to stay on top. So kind of keeping that as the backdrop in how we approach things, let's kind of get into the nuts and bolts a little bit. So this annual review, where does it come from? Well, it comes from an SEC rule 20647. It's called the compliance rule. This, like a lot of rules on the advisor side of the world, is an interesting rule because it's very short and to the point. There's 3 requirements of the compliance rule. Number 1, you have to have written policies and procedures that are reasonably designed to prevent violation. Okay, great. Number 2, that you have to conduct a review no less than annually of the adequacy of your procedures and the effectiveness of their implementation. Wow, can't talk today. And then number 3, and this is the easy one, designate a chief compliance officer to administer these policies and procedures. So someone has to draw the short straw and be the CCO of the firm. And this is the entire rule, these 3 sentences right here. So we have to take these 3 sentences, and how do we apply them to real world RIAs when it comes to having a manual and doing an annual review? Well, we kind of know, what that looks like based on helping firms through examinations and interpretive opinions and no action letters. We take these 1 sentences and we have to kind of apply them to a large business. So when we talk about an annual review specifically, you're trying to assess really 2 main things: the adequacy of your firm's compliance program, of the policies and procedures. Have you conducted things like a risk assessment and things like that? And then the effectiveness. Is the firm implementing the procedures the way they were designed to. And one key component that helps with the effectiveness is using a tool that we call a compliance calendar. Compliance calendar is something else I'm going to talk about as this presentation goes on a little bit, and the importance of using a compliance calendar to help you stay on top of the responsibilities of your compliance responsibilities. Then, of course, an annual review, documenting the annual review and making changes. And keep in mind that elements of an annual review you may actually have already accomplished throughout the course of the year. And the annual review is really the time to bring all these various components together in one nice, neat package. Okay, so let's kind of go through what some of the from our perspective as a consulting firm, what we think are a lot of the key steps and components of an annual review. And there's really these 8 things that we focus on as a consulting firm and helping firms with annual reviews is making sure you're going through these 8 steps. Firm background, and we'll talk about that. Conducting a risk assessment, and we're going to talk a lot about the risk assessment because that's kind of a funny one there, or an interesting one. Checklist, the use of checklists, regulatory developments, your actual procedures, your advisory documents, the Form ADVs, conducting an annual compliance meeting, and of course a summary. So let's kind of break these down into a little bit more detail on each one of these. First one is the firm background. So as part of your annual review, when you start this annual review, typically at the end of the year, the first thing I would suggest you do is start with the firm background. Take a look at your firm for the last 12 months since your previous annual review. Did you have a lot of growth? Have you increased your assets under management significantly, more so than just normal appreciation of assets? Did you do something to substantially grow your AUM? Like bringing on new IARs, new branch offices. Those can create, this growth, which we think is great, right? It's great for a lot of firms, but growth also from a regulator's perspective creates what we consider growing pains. Growing pains are deficiencies that are going to pop up because your firm has grown at a significant rate. So your firm background, you look at this, did things change in the last 12 months? We know from many times when the SEC has talked about IARs and detached branch offices and supervision, that's an area of concern for a lot of regulators is, do firms reasonably supervise their IARs? So if you are a firm that's had a lot of growth with adding additional IARs and branch offices, then that's an area that you're going to look at. Are we reasonably supervising in these last 12 months? Do we need to make changes? So that's kind of an example of why you look at firm growth. Fee changes. Did you change your fee structure at all with your firm? Did you add a performance fee maybe? Have you offered new services? Maybe in the past, all you did was asset management, and now you've included or added financial planning as a service. So those types of changes can have other effects from a compliance perspective, and you need to take that overall look at your firm and what has changed with your firm in the last 12 months, including things like working with third parties. Maybe you're working with RIA in a box, maybe you're working with Redtail, maybe you added a new custodial relationship. So those are things to keep in mind, and it's a good place to start with your annual review. The second one that we talked about, or I mentioned briefly, was risk assessment. Now, this is the interesting thing about the risk assessment. The compliance rule 20647, nor any state rule that I'm aware of, actually talks about the word risk or risk assessment. However, what we do know from helping firms through many exams and things like that is that the SEC will routinely ask for an inventory of your risks that form the basis for your policies and procedures in your compliance program. So regulators are expecting firms to conduct a risk assessment. Even though the term risk didn't show up, we know it's going to be asked during the course of an exam. So yes, you need to conduct a risk assessment. The argument is going to be, there is no possible way for you to build a compliance program internally or build a policies and procedures manual if you don't do an internal risk assessment. Okay, so at RIA in a Box, how we help firms with risk assessments is we kind of break it down into 4 steps. The first step is to prepare a risk inventory. If you've never done this before, what I mean specifically is make a list. I want you to make a list of every risk that you could possibly think of. Our risk inventory tool that we use with firms has roughly 150 or 160 different risks on there. Yeah, it's a lot, but we're trying to find every possible risk out there. Okay, and you go through this 150 or 160 list in our case, and you assign a rating to each of those risks. Now, the way we like to do the rating is the light system: red light, yellow light, green light. Green light, no, it's good. You're good. You don't have any risk in that particular item. Yellow light, maybe there's some risk there, something to keep an eye on. And then a red light means, yes, our firm has this risk. Now we have to mitigate that risk. We mitigate that risk by mapping it back to our policies and procedures. We have a procedure to mitigate that risk. So let me give you a quick example of what I mean by all this. Let's say you're a firm that does performance advertising. Well, do you have a risk of putting out a marketing piece violating the Advisors Act because you have bad performance and you've misstated performance? Well, yes, that would be a red risk. If you do a lot of advertising and you use performance advertising, this is going to be a high risk area. So how do you mitigate that risk? Is you have a procedure in place that all advertising has to be reviewed. Maybe we use a third party to help us with reviewing advertising and coming up with appropriate disclosures, and no marketing piece gets put out there without going through a specific process, a compliance process. So that's how we've mapped that risk back to our procedures. We have a procedure for performance advertising. We follow that procedure every time we want to do performance advertising. That's how I mitigate the risk, because we know performance advertising is a high risk area as viewed by most regulators. So that's just one example. And yes, we do, our risk process is literally 150, 160 different risks. And that's just, something we've created over time by coming up with different risks that all advisors across the country will come across at some point in time. Then, of course, you're going to review and update this risk assessment. The first time you do a risk assessment, it's not a lot of fun. Every time you do one after that, it gets easier and easier and easier, okay? But it is a critical component of doing your annual review, is doing an internal risk assessment. Now, the SEC put this document out there many years ago when they first, when they were talking about risk assessments and things. And as you can see, this is just a one-page document with 12 main categories and a lot of little subcategories. And this is a pretty good starting point. I'm sure you can still find this online if you wanted to, just by putting in your search engine, probably Securities and Exchange Commission Risk Inventory Guide. This is out on the internet, and this was produced by the SEC, and it's a good starting point. But if you went through each of those little bullets in there, you're going to start to see, you add them up, there's a lot of risks even in this one-page document. So it's not hard to believe that as a consulting firm, ours is like 150 or 160 different risks. You start adding them, and you can come up with quite a few. And you may find 75, 80% of them are green light. They're not a risk for your firm, but you still have to look at them. And then every year you reevaluate because of those changes within your firm. That's why that was the first step, looking at your firm, what's changed, because your risk assessment may change from year to year. And this is how you uncover those growing pains and those deficiencies. The next one was checklist. So this is the third one we're talking about, our checklist. Do you use checklists for various tasks? We like to use a lot of different checklists. Maybe you use a checklist whenever you do a best execution review. And that's just a document that would walk you through how to conduct best execution review of your custodian and broker dealers that you use. Maybe you have a checklist you use for due diligence on working with third-party service providers. A lot of these checklists can also help you in testing of certain procedures. And testing is one of those fancy words that gets thrown around a lot, just like the risk that gets thrown around a lot. So does testing. Testing is part of your annual review process that you need to be able to test your procedures periodically. And give you an example of that is like a disaster day is what we call it. A disaster day would be one day out of the year you pick to check your business continuity plan. Did it work? If you had a disaster such as a loss of power, an earthquake or something, how do you function as an advisor? How do you provide those fiduciary services still? Well, you have a business continuity plan that walks you through a lot of that, hopefully. And disaster day is the day you test those procedures. Hopefully you don't have to ever use them, but you test those procedures, and maybe you use a checklist to walk you through that. Maybe instead of individual checklists, you use like an annual checklist that's kind of all encompassing. And there's a lot of other different checklists out there, but I'm a strong proponent of using these checklists to kind of walk you through various compliance tasks and to help you stay on top of these tasks to make sure you're doing them and you're testing your procedures. All right, the fourth component of our annual review is we're going to spend time reviewing the year's key developments. And what I mean by that is items that maybe the SEC or NASA, which is the North America Securities Administrators Association, which is all the state regulators put together. NASA, the states individually, and the SEC, they put out information to help advisors, whether it's some type of risk alert or interpretive opinion or new rule. Lots of information comes from the regulators every year. Examination priorities, the SEC does those in the beginning of every year. January, February time, you're going to get the SEC examination priorities. So lots of different resources, also just your normal news and other periodicals. Lots of different resources out there, and you need to review those on it, as they come out, obviously. But at the end of the year, I would take a look back at all the things that have happened in the 12 months from a regulatory perspective. We've had a lot of things come out lately. Form ADV, which is, part 3, the Form CRS, that's fairly new. That's obviously something that would come up in the last year. So the DOL rule is another one. And here's one that some people are not familiar with or didn't know is IAR continuing education. For anybody out there that's familiar with the broker-dealer side, you're familiar with continuing education. It's been part of the broker-dealer industry for quite a long time. And now the RIA industry is looking to create continuing education for IARs. There are a few states that are working on adopting the NASA model rule for continuing education. So it's going to be a requirement in a handful of states next year that you need to do continuing education as an IAR. That's brand new. It's just come out. So it's important to take a look at those last 12 months, review the year's key developments, because that should be a part of your annual review. All right, number 5, and this is probably, maybe one of the more important ones out of the 5. Obviously, the risk assessment, in my perspective, they're all important, but if we're going to rank them a little bit, maybe this one gets number 1, and that is your policies and procedures. And this quote from the SEC, essentially what it's trying to convey is that basically every firm needs to have policies and procedures. And your policies and procedures of your firm may look completely different than the policies and procedures of the firm down the street. Maybe the size of those firms are different, their business models are different, but at the end of the day, everybody's going to need to have policies and procedures, and they need to be applicable for your firm, okay? So when we talk about your policies and procedures manual and how this pertains to an annual review, well, the first thing you're going to do is a full review of your manual. Okay, it needs to be applicable to your firm. I rather have you as a regulator, I rather have you not address something than address something that you're not actually doing. Okay, a lot of times we kind of view that even a bigger negative is if you have stuff in there that's not even applicable to you, because it kind of tells me as a regulator that you didn't put a lot of thought or effort into your manual. Now, there's a lot of third parties, including RIA in a box, that we create manuals for RIAs. A lot of firms do that. I can tell you right now, nobody is ever going to do a perfect job. They're all going to be wrong to some element. The only one that can build a perfect manual for your firm is going to be you, because you are physically there. Now, a lot of people, a lot of consultants like RIA in a box or other consultants or legal firms, we may get you really close, but at the end of the day, you have to take ownership of that manual, go through it, make sure it's applicable to your firm, read every word. Now, if your manual includes a code of ethics, business continuity plan, cybersecurity, privacy policy, and anti-money laundering, that's great. A lot of times these may be standalone documents. That's fine as well if they're standalone documents, but I would suggest doing a review of those documents as well if they are standalone. If they're part of your overall policies and procedures manual, that's great. Nothing wrong with that. If they're separate, that's fine as well, but make sure you do a review of all of them then. Obviously, updates and changes, you have to remember to distribute that to staff. I have seen a lot of firms that do a great job of updating them, but then they kind of forget to give that updated manual out to the staff. Well, it didn't do you much good to update it if you didn't give it to everybody. So make sure you, when you do update your manual, this living, breathing document, right? Because it's not static. It shouldn't stay static. It should always be changing, living and breathing. So when you update this manual periodically, whether it's monthly, semi-monthly, or quarterly, every 6 months or every year, that you remember to give those updates to your staff. And then of course you want to collect the attestations from your staff, from your reps, from administrative help, whatever, from everybody that they've read and will abide by the manual. Alrighty. So compliance calendar, this really relates to the policies and procedures, because your policies and procedures are going to have some details of things that you're supposed to be doing. Well, the calendar is there to help you, remind you of these specific tasks to be performed. Now, there are third-party calendars out there. There's calendars you can create on your own. Some of them are just nothing more than an Excel spreadsheet. I don't care how you do it, as long as you use a calendar. That is a critical tool on the compliance side, is using a calendar that is going to remind you of the specific task performed. Ideally, it'll tell you how it will be performed. It'll walk you through the task, who is responsible for performing the task, and then of course also helping you document that the task was actually completed. Summary of your calendar events, we use what's called the compliance log in our company. That summary of these calendar events that you completed can be very useful as part of your annual review, because it shows a record of all the things that you've actually accomplished during the course of the year, and that becomes an important element of part of your annual review. All right. Reviewing the advisory documents. So after you've gone through the policies and procedures manual and all those other manuals we talked about, whether it's business continuity or AML or whatever, you need to also take a look at your advisory documents, your Form ADV Part 1, your Form ADV Part 2A, or RAP brochure if you're using a RAP brochure, the individual 2Bs, and if you're an SEC firm, you're going to have the Form CRS or referred as ADV Part 3. So your ADVs need to be, ship shape. You need to know what's in there. Makes sense, right? One of the things that, as a former regulator, when I used to do a lot of exams, is I like to see how well firms can explain things in their ADVs. Because as a regulator, it's not unusual. It's quite common to hear you, explain what it is that you do. And then when we review your documents, there tends to be a little bit of a disconnect quite often. And that's why a lot of exams will have deficiencies relating to content of their ADVs. So it's important for you to know, what's in your ADVs, be able to explain what's in your ADVs, and then hopefully match that up with the services that you're providing. Advisory contracts, do a quick review of your advisory contract, whatever template agreement you're using. Same thing with your new account forms. And I don't really care what you call it, whether it's a new account form, a suitability questionnaire, a client profile, or what we like to call them our IPSs, or investment policy statements. At the end of the day, the way I look at those documents is that it's just your method of documenting and memorializing the suitability information, the due diligence you've collected on your clients, because that's the information you use to determine the investment advice you have to provide. And so you're just memorializing that information. In every exam, we're going to ask to see that information. And then the last advisory document would be the privacy policy. So obviously these are all kind of client facing, except for the first one, ADV Part 1. Most firms don't hand out an ADV Part 1 because you don't really have to, although it is a public document. The rest of these are things you're going to actually hand out to the client, so they're client facing. So it's a good idea to review those every year to make sure they're still accurate and they're still describing what it is that your firm does. All righty. And then we have staff training compliance meeting. Compliance meetings don't have to be in person. Compliance meetings can be through Zoom, like we're talking today. It can be any form you really want. And I would always create an agenda for a compliance meeting and hit on a lot of elements that we've already talked about. This is kind of towards the end of your annual review is, talk about, hey, what are the changes we've had in this last year? What are the regulatory changes? Did we have changes in our documents? Other hot topics. Maybe this is a great time for you to collect your attestations. The important thing to remember, though, is you want to make sure you give your staff the ability to ask questions. Okay. And sometimes that gets overlooked as you zip through your compliance meeting and nobody got to ask questions. Make sure people have the opportunity to ask questions of your compliance meeting, of your annual meeting. And of course, everything in compliance, this is like being in high school and you have to turn your homework in to get credit. Same thing here. You need to document what you've done. Otherwise, you don't get credit for it. So just like high school, you had to turn your homework in. Here, you need to document what you've done. So when you do a compliance meeting, you want to document who was there, keep a sign-in list somehow, and just a quick outline. What topics did you cover? And that goes in your file. And then you always have that until next year. And you can look at what you did the previous year and change it up a little bit. All righty. And then the eighth part of the final step in your annual review is just a summary of your annual review. Document your key findings and summarize them. Depending on the size of your firm, you may need to schedule an upper level management meeting to discuss the findings, review these findings, create action steps that are going to need to be taken, additional testing of your program. If you uncovered some findings, there's that testing word again, because we love to test our procedures. And then any additional follow-up that you may need to do because of your annual review. Now, at this point in time, I'm going to kind of turn it over here to hopefully I'll be able to address any questions that are in the queue. So give me a second here. Let's see here.
Perfect. I'm also going to thank you because I know that was a lot of information. I'm sitting here, I'm like, and so I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, 100% documenting everything. But just again, as a reminder for everyone while we're kind of getting situated, if you do have questions, I haven't seen anything flow through, but like I said, I know there was a lot in there. So if you're like me, absorbing it all, obviously, again, we'll go ahead and share that. But if you have those questions at the bottom of the little Zoom, might be at the top, depending on how yours is situated, you should actually see that kind of questionnaire to pop in your question. Chad, it does look like a question came in for us here.
Okay.
So let me go ahead. Let's go ahead and just reshare. I'm not sure if you want to go ahead and have your PowerPoint up, because I know sometimes people like to go back and point something out. But
Okay,
the first question. Oh yeah, go for it. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. First question's coming from Sarah Wisniewski. So hi, Sarah, actually. Where would we get a tracking spreadsheet?
Sure. So, compliance, we absolutely love spreadsheets. And I just use Excel way back in the day, long before I was a regulator. I'd create my own tracking spreadsheets as I needed them because they work. But there's a lot of consulting firms out there, and such as, like for instance, our RIA, we do use a compliance calendar, which is a way of tracking those various tasks. So unless you're going to do it manually in-house with a spreadsheet, you'd have to look for a consulting firm that actually has a calendar that you can utilize. If that's not in your budget, that's understandable, but I would certainly at least start creating some spreadsheets to help you track this. Just simple Excel, nothing, you don't need to go farther than that. If your business model, isn't quite that complicated yet, then keep it simple until you get to the point where no, we need some outside help.
Perfect. And she went ahead and said thank you so much. So you're welcome, Sarah. And then someone else, actually, it looks like Jacob just messaged in sample compliance calendar ? So not sure if you have one, or again, kind of like a tip that might be.
I kind of answered that with the last one. I don't have a sample compliance calendar, but it's not too difficult to build. Go through your policies and procedures manual. You are going to have things in your manual that says we do this every month. Okay, great. If I do that task every month, then in my calendar, I'm going to pick a day that I'm going to do that task. So let's just say, for argument's sake, in your manual, it says we review a trade blotter every month. Okay, great. So maybe the end of the month, I'm going to put a thing on my calendar, a repeating event every month. It's going to say review trade blotter. Now I've created a compliance calendar. The one thing I want to point out about creating the compliance calendar, which I think is really important, is that there's a lot of tasks in your manual where you're going to do them once a year. However, I don't want you to block 2 weeks out of your life at the end of December to do all these tasks. That's not how you do compliance. Compliance is something you should be doing daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, semi-annually, and annually. And so when we look at a lot of annual tasks that you have, for instance, a best execution review, spread them out through the year. I know on our calendar, I think best execution pops up pretty early in the quarter. I think we have firms doing that, I want to say in February, but you have the ability to pick any day you want. Your disaster day, right? When you check your business continuity plan, pick a day to do that. It doesn't have to be at the end of the year. It can be any day during the year, but spread that out and you keep compliance and small manageable tasks that way versus, everything in December. Oh my goodness.
And I will say the trainer in me is really loving this next response here because it's actually in correspondence to that kind of question and then the feedback. So this is from Elke. We schedule compliance workflows in Redtail. So 1000%. If workflows, again, are that tool that you are useful for, I'm not going to go down that road because I know everyone kind of works differently with workflows, but the calendar itself, workflows, activities, all of those are exactly what we're talking about, where it's keeping track of it and documenting it. Because again, I can't tell you what I did last week. It can if it's in Redtail. So that is where, again, we're going to plug that in. But it looks like the next question here. So thank you, Elke. I love, like I said, the trainer me loves that response that came in. But the next one here is from Anonymous. It's kind of a multi-question, so bear with me. But it says, what are the odds of an audit? Any stats, any red flags, actions that trigger an audit? So kind of that whole group.
Yep. No, great question. So what are the odds of an audit? Very high, close to 100%. We often say it's not if you're going to get audited, it's when are you going to get audited? States tend to be pretty active, depending on, there are some states that audit firms every year. A lot of states try to do more of like a 3 to 4 year cycle. The SEC has really changed a lot of how they approach audits. You may have noticed that in the last few years, the SEC has started a new audit program where every new SEC firm gets audited in the first 12 months, right around that 12-month mark, give or take. And it's this new registrant audit is what they call it. So if you are in the industry as an RIA, you are going to get audited, whether it's a state regulator or an SEC examiner that shows up. I will say the majority of the audits we're seeing right now are they're by far almost 100% are virtual audits. A lot of that dealing obviously with the global pandemic we're going through. A lot of these audits are in a virtual type of format, meaning they're a desk audit. They're not physically coming out to your office anymore, but I'm sure that'll change down the road. From a statistics perspective, and there's some publications you can find that kind of go over stats a little bit with audits, but I would say, easily, I'm going to throw out a number, maybe 90-95% of them, something around there, are probably going to end with nothing more than, simple deficiency letters. It's, the audits that you've kind of fell off the stream of what you're supposed to be doing. There's some serious things going on. Those are the types of audits that go a little bit further with some type of enforcement type of action, but make an effort and do it, do the things that you're supposed to be doing, and just make an effort. Understand you're not going to be perfect. As a regulator, I never expected perfection. I just wanted to see that you're making an effort and no harm is being done. So those are that's about it, I guess.
So I have a feeling this might be the same person, but if not, it might be just, again, kind of in the same tangent. But so it says, we are new to SEC 3 years ago, have not had any contact. Should we reach out to them or wait?
No, I would not reach out to the SEC.
I read it. I'm like, oh no.
Yeah, I would not reach out to the SEC. They will show up when they are ready to show up. Audits can be routine. They can be for cause. They can, industry, believe it or not, tells on each other quite a bit. As a regulator, I did a lot of audits from industry telling on industry. So, and just client complaints can. So there's a lot of different sources. And a lot of times, the majority of the times, you were just lucky. It was random. You were just a lucky person that month to get audited. So they can, wait it out. They'll be there eventually.
Perfect. All right. Well, that was the last of the questions so far. Again, if you guys have any, I'm not going to rush anyone, because I know if you're like me, you'll write like a whole novel out. So no rush, definitely get it. But again, if you have those questions, go ahead and pop them in. This is now the time to have that. And then again, of course, in the meantime, if you do have questions, you are more than welcome, I'm sure, to always reach out to either one of us with those questions, whether it is more, again, with the topic discussed today, or if again, it is more of implementing those practices with your own Redtail subscription. Again, we'll be able to feed off of either one of those different ideas. But again, I don't want to rush anyone, but if you have those questions, definitely now's that time. But while we're kind of given some moments here, again, I just want to go ahead and take this moment to thank not only all of the attendees that hopped on, but Chad, thank you so much for joining us today. Like I said, there was so much information that you were able to share with us and really just kind of, I think, kind of give that awareness, as you said, like we're wrapping up at the end of the year. And I don't know about everyone else, but at the end of the year, it's like crunch time. So I just, again, want to thank you for that.
Thanks so much for joining us today for this particular session. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to give us a call at 800-206-5030, option 3 for support, or just shoot us an email over to support@redtailtechnology.com. Thanks a lot and have a great day.